Carl Reiner said they would have been a couple if things had been different. Dick Van Dyke said it was more like a sibling relationship. Mary Tyler Moore said she loved everything about him, his kindness, his humor, his dance, and connected to all of it. Three versions of the same story. Three people who were there. And now, at 100 years old, Van Dyke is the only one still here to say which version was closest to the truth. This is not a scandal. There is nothing here that was ever hidden in shame or whispered in secrecy. What happened between Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore across 5 of the most brilliant years in American television history is something far more complicated than scandal, and far more interesting. It is the story of 2 extraordinary people who found in each other exactly what the other needed, who built something together that neither could have built alone, and who carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives without ever fully agreeing on what to call it. Carl Reiner, the man who created The Dick Van Dyke Show, who cast them both, who watched them every single day across 5 seasons, went to his grave in June of 2020 with one last thing he wanted the world to know. He said that both of them had admitted it privately. He said that if they had not been married to other people, they definitely would have been a couple. He said they were made for each other. Dick Van Dyke has never confirmed that, but he has never denied it either. And the question that hovers over everything, the question that Carl Reiner answered one way, that Mary answered another way, and that Dick has been living with for 100 years, is this: what do you call a love that never became a romance, but that changed everything about who you were? Van Dyke is 100 years old. Every friend he has ever had is gone. And somewhere in that extraordinary, lonely, long life, the memory of a woman who made everything better is still with him. This is that story. Richard Wayne Van Dyke was born on the 13th of December, 1925, in Danville, Illinois, a small Midwestern city that produced, in those years, exactly the kind of quiet American childhood that leaves no obvious trace of what is coming. His father, Loren Wayne Van Dyke, worked as a salesman. His mother, Hazel Victoria Van Dyke, kept the home. There was nothing in the household that announced the arrival of a future legend. No theatrical tradition, no artistic lineage, no early prodigy stories that the family told at dinner. Dick Van Dyke was simply a boy from a small town in Illinois, and by every visible measure, that is all anyone expected him to remain. But there was something in him from the very beginning that refused the ordinary. Not ambition exactly, not the kind that announces itself and burns with impatience. Something quieter, a need to make people laugh, a physical restlessness that expressed itself in movement, in timing, in the instinctive reading of a room. He was funny the way certain people simply are. Not because they studied it, but because they could not help it. The joke arrived before the thought did. The body moved before the mind gave the instruction. It was not a skill he developed. It was a frequency he was born tuned to. He grew up during the Depression, in a country that had very little use for laughter and very great need of it. He watched his parents navigate a world that offered no guarantees. He learned early what it meant to hold a room together with something other than money. He learned that the right moment, the right turn of phrase, the right physical gesture, the right beat of silence before the word landed, could change the temperature of an entire space. That was a kind of power. It was the only kind he ever wanted. When the Second World War came, Van Dyke served in the United States Army Air Forces. He was stationed stateside, training pilots who would go where he did not. He never saw combat. He spent those years in the particular American purgatory of being young and willing and watching the war from a distance. doing what was asked, and waiting for the world to return to something that resembled the future he had imagined. What he carried out of those years was not trauma, but patience, and a discipline he had not walked in with. After the war, he found his way into radio, then into early local television in Kansas City. He was learning in real time on live broadcasts that allowed no correction, what it meant to hold an audience's attention without a net beneath you. Every mistake was permanent. Every recovery had to be immediate. He was building, without knowing it, the specific set of reflexes that would make him, a decade later, one of the most instinctively collaborative performers in the history of American comedy. Danville, Illinois, had given him nothing except everything that mattered. The discipline, the instinct, the patience, the need. The world had not heard of him yet, but it was about to. The moment that changed everything happened not in a television studio, but on a Broadway stage. In the spring of 1960, during a production that almost did not include Dick Van Dyke at all. The show was Bye Bye Birdie, a musical comedy about rock and roll, small-town America, and the particular hysteria of celebrity. Van Dyke was playing Albert Peterson, the nervous, well-meaning manager at the center of the chaos. He was 34 years old. He had been working in television and radio for years, building a reputation in rooms that were too small for the size of what he was capable of. Bye Bye Birdie was his first real Broadway lead. It was also the performance that a writer and producer named Carl Reiner happened to attend on a night when he was looking for something, though he did not yet know exactly what he was looking for. Carl Reiner had already written a pilot for a television show. The show was called Head of the Family, and it was semi-autobiographical. The story of a television comedy writer navigating the competing demands of his professional life and his home life. Reiner had written it for himself. He had played the lead. The network had watched it, found it promising, and then told Reiner, with the particular cruelty of institutional politeness, that what the show needed was someone else in the starring role. What the show needed, as it turned out, was the man Reiner saw on the stage of Bye Bye Birdie. Van Dyke had something that cannot be taught and cannot be manufactured. A physical comedy genius that was simultaneously broad enough to fill a theater and precise enough to land on a single camera frame. He was loose where other performers were stiff. He was warm where other performers were merely charming. He could take a pratfall with the commitment of a trained acrobat and deliver a line with the casual ease of a man who had just thought of it. He moved like someone who had made peace with his own body, in a way that most people never do. Reiner watched him and understood immediately. This was the man the show had been waiting for. The retooled pilot, now called The Dick Van Dyke Show, was produced by Sheldon Leonard and written by Carl Reiner, with Van Dyke at the center of everything. The premise was clean and deceptively simple. Rob Petrie, a comedy writer for a fictional television variety show called The Alan Brady Show, living in suburban New Rochelle, New York, with his wife Laura and their young son Richie, navigating the gap between the glamour of his professional world and the warm, comic ordinariness of his domestic one. It was, in almost every structural sense, the perfect vehicle for what Van Dyke could do. But the show was missing something. Or rather, someone. The role of Laura Petrie, Rob's wife, required a performer who could hold her own against Van Dyke's physical comedy without being overwhelmed by it, who could play warmth without sentimentality, who could be funny without undercutting the emotional reality of the scenes, and who could make a television marriage feel genuinely alive rather than merely functional. It was, in short, one of the hardest roles in early American television to cast correctly. Carl Reiner and Sheldon Leonard looked at a great many actresses. None of them were quite right. And then they found a 23-year-old woman who had almost no television credits, who had been playing bit parts and small roles, who had a quality in front of a camera that was almost impossible to describe in an audition note, but impossible to ignore in the room. She had comic timing that seemed less like a skill she had acquired, and more like a natural sense of rhythm she had always possessed. She had warmth that registered as real rather than performed. She had an intelligence behind the eyes that suggested she was always 2 steps ahead of the scene she was playing. Her name was Mary Tyler Moore. Van Dyke's first response, on learning she had been cast, was not enthusiasm. It was hesitation. He later admitted, with the candor of a man looking back across 60 years, that his first thought was simply, "She is too young to be my wife." She was 23. He was 35. The age gap seemed, in that first moment of professional assessment, like a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be accepted. It was not a problem. It was, as it turned out, completely irrelevant to everything that mattered. The Dick Van Dyke Show premiered on the 3rd of October 1961 on the Columbia Broadcasting System. The first episode aired. The ratings came in, and the numbers were, by every measurement available to the network at the time, a catastrophe. The show had the worst ratings of any program on television that night. The network considered canceling it immediately. Carl Reiner and Sheldon Leonard argued for more time. The network, with the reluctant patience of an institution that has occasionally been wrong before, agreed to continue. What no one in that room yet understood, not the network, not the producers, not even Van Dyke himself, was that somewhere in the space between the 35-year-old man from Danville, Illinois, and the 23-year-old woman they had almost not cast, something had already begun to happen. Something that would take 5 years to fully become itself. Something that Carl Reiner would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. Something that neither Van Dyke nor Moore would ever entirely agree on. But something real. Undeniably, irreversibly real. Mary Tyler Moore was born on the 29th of December, 1936, in Brooklyn, New York. 11 years and 16 days after the man she would spend the next 5 years making television history with. She had grown up in a household that offered her, in roughly equal measure, a love of performance and a complicated relationship with approval. She had studied dance as a child. She had the discipline of someone who had been told early that talent alone was insufficient. That talent required work, required precision, required the willingness to be wrong in rehearsal so that you could be right when it counted. She carried that discipline into everything she did professionally, and it would become, in the years ahead, one of the things that made her irreplaceable. When she arrived on the set of the Dick Van Dyke Show in 1961, she was 23 years old and largely unknown. She had done some television work, a handful of appearances, a recurring role as a pair of legs in a telephone company commercial, small parts in small productions. Nothing that prepared anyone watching for what she was about to become. What the camera found in Mary Tyler Moore from the very first episode, was something that the entertainment industry spends enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture and almost never succeeds in producing on demand. She had presence, not the aggressive, attention-commanding presence of a performer who has learned to take a room, but something quieter and more durable. She was present, in the most literal sense of the word. She was entirely in the scene, entirely in the moment, entirely available to whatever the other actor was giving her. And what that meant, in practical terms, was that every scene she played with Dick Van Dyke felt like something that was actually happening rather than something that was being performed. Van Dyke recognized it immediately. Not in the first read-through, perhaps. Not even in the first week of shooting. But somewhere in the early weeks of that first season, in the accumulated experience of standing across from her in scene after scene, he understood that he was working with someone who was operating at a frequency he had not encountered before. She was not trying to keep up with him. She was not working to match his energy or compensate for his physical comedy. She was simply there, reading him, responding to him, giving him something to work against that was genuine rather than manufactured. He later reflected on it with the directness of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding craft. They became like an improv group, he said. You could give them a scene, and they could make it up. She read him. He read her timing. And it was, he said, just such a pleasure. Moore, for her part, brought to the role of Laura Petrie, something that the writing alone could not have provided. Laura Petrie was, on the page, a wife and mother in suburban New Rochelle, a character type that early American television had already produced in abundance, typically rendered as either decorative or comedic in a broad, undignified way. Moore made her something else entirely. She made her specific. She gave Laura Petrie an interiority, a life that seemed to exist beyond the edges of the frame, beyond the scenes the camera was capturing. She laughed when something was funny, and not when it was not. She disagreed with her husband, and was not immediately wrong to do so. She was, in the context of 1961 American television, something genuinely radical. A woman on screen who felt like a person. The chemistry between them built across the first season with the slow, organic accumulation of two people learning how to be in the same room together. Not the explosive, immediate chemistry of performers who are performing chemistry, but the quieter, more durable kind that comes from genuine mutual recognition. By the second season, when the show had found its audience and the audience had found the show, what Van Dyke and Moore had together on screen was something that critics struggled to name, precisely because it did not fit any of the available categories. It was not romantic tension, it was not mere professional competence, it was not the comfortable predictability of a well-rehearsed partnership. It was something that felt alive in the specific way that real things feel alive. Unpredictable at the edges, grounded at the center, and incapable of being replicated by anyone else, with anyone else. Nobody left the set at night. Moore said it herself, years later, with the simple clarity of someone describing a fact rather than a sentiment. They loved being there. The cast, the crew, the writers, Van Dyke, Moore, they stayed. Not because they were required to. Because the set of The Dick Van Dyke Show was, for 5 years, one of the best places any of them had ever been. Van Dyke described those years with 3 words that he has returned to in interview after interview across 6 decades. 3 words that carry, in their simplicity, more weight than most people's most elaborate descriptions of professional achievement. The best 5 years of his life. That is what he called them. Not the most successful, not the most celebrated, the best. And Moore, who went on to win Emmy Awards, to create her own legendary show, to become one of the most consequential figures in the history of American television, said something about those 5 years that is, in its way, even more striking. She said that she got to go to work every day with Dick Van Dyke. She said it the way you say something that you know, in the saying of it, to be one of the great privileges of your existence. She loved him. She was entirely clear about that. She loved his kindness. She loved his humor. She loved his dance. Everything about him, she said, she loved and connected to. The show ran for 5 seasons, from 1961 to 1966, and won Emmy Awards and changed the way American television understood what a comedy could be and do and say. It made Dick Van Dyke a star of the first order. It made Mary Tyler Moore, at 29 years old, one of the most recognizable women in America. And then, in 1966, it ended. By design. Van Dyke and Moore and Carl Reiner decided together to stop while the show was still at the height of its powers, to close the door themselves rather than wait for the audience or the network to close it for them. It was the right decision. It was also, as decisions go, one of the lonelier ones, because when it was over, what they had built together was over. The set they had refused to leave at night was gone. The room that had been the best room any of them had ever been in was no longer available to them. What remained was the memory of it. And the question that Carl Reiner would spend the next 50 years trying to answer, of what exactly it had been. There is a particular kind of professional relationship that the entertainment industry produces very rarely and almost never on purpose. It is not a friendship exactly, though friendship is part of it. It is not a romance, though it contains something that resembles what romance feels like from the inside. It is not merely a working partnership, though the work is what makes it visible. It is something that exists in the overlap between all three of those things, in the space where two people discover that they are more capable together than they are separately, and that the experience of being in that space is one of the finest things that professional life has to offer. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore had that. For 5 years, on the set of The Dick Van Dyke Show, they had it every single working day. And the question that everyone who watched it, Carl Reiner, the writers, the crew, the audience at home, found themselves unable to fully answer was a deceptively simple one. Where exactly did the performance end? The scenes they played together were written by some of the best comedy writers in American television. The situations were constructed with care and precision. The dialogue was crafted. And yet what happened when Van Dyke and Moore were in the same frame together consistently exceeded what the writing alone could account for. The scenes were better than they should have been. The moments were warmer than the page had prepared for. The laughter was realer than any laugh track required. Van Dyke spoke about it in terms of improvisation, the specific, elevated kind of improvisation that only becomes available to two performers who have spent enough time together to have built a shared language. They became, he said, like an improv group. You could give them a scene, and they could make it up. She read him very well, and he read her timing very well. And the pleasure of it was, he said, unlike anything else he had experienced in his professional life. That is a significant statement from a man who had worked in some of the finest rooms in American entertainment. It is also a statement that contains, in its precision, something worth pausing on. He did not say she was the most talented person he had ever worked with, though she may well have been. He did not say she was the funniest or the most technically accomplished. He said she read him very well. He said he read her timing very well. He was describing something mutual, something that moved in both directions simultaneously. And what he was describing, though he used the language of craft to describe it, is something that most people would recognize more readily as intimacy. Not romantic intimacy, something adjacent to it, but distinct from it. The intimacy of two people who have learned to trust each other completely in the specific context of doing something they both love at the highest level they are capable of. The intimacy of being genuinely known in the particular way that a great collaborator knows you. Not your biography, not your private life, but the rhythm of your thinking, the pattern of your instincts, the precise moment when you are about to do something brilliant, and the precise moment when you need someone to catch you before you miss. Moore understood this too, though she expressed it differently. She described Van Dyke as the most generous person she had ever worked with. That word, generous, is worth staying with for a moment, because in the context of performance, it carries a specific technical meaning that is not immediately obvious. A generous performer is one who gives the scene to the other actor, who does not hoard the moment, who actively works to make the other person better, funnier, more alive on screen, even when the cost of doing so is their own moment in the spotlight. It is, in many ways, the rarest quality in professional entertainment. And it is the quality that separates the truly great collaborators from the merely excellent solo performers. Van Dyke was generous with Moore in every scene they played together. And Moore, who absorbed that generosity and returned it in kind, bloomed in a way that was visible to every person on the set. He delighted in her success. That was how she described it, not tolerated it, not accepted it with professional grace, delighted in it. He watched her grow, and it thrilled him. And what that created, over 5 years of daily proximity and daily collaboration, was something that Carl Reiner had a front-row seat to observe from the very first episode to the very last. Carl Reiner watched all of it. He was there every day, not just as a producer overseeing the production, but as a writer who understood what he was watching and as a friend who understood what he was seeing. He was, in many ways, the most qualified witness to what happened between Van Dyke and Moore across those 5 years, because he was both close enough to see the details and experienced enough to understand what the details meant. He saw the way they worked together. He saw the way they were with each other between takes. The ease, the warmth, the specific quality of attention they paid to each other that was different from the way either of them was with anyone else on the set. He saw it accumulate, season by season, episode by episode, into something that was not nothing. And he drew a conclusion from what he saw, a conclusion that he held privately for decades. Through the end of the show, through Van Dyke's subsequent career, through Moore's subsequent career, through marriages and children and awards and years of distance between them, and that he finally stated plainly, in public, only after Mary Tyler Moore was gone. What Reiner said, when Moore died in January of 2017, was this: that both of them had admitted it to him privately, not together, separately, in the way that people admit things when they are not performing for each other. They had both admitted that if they had not been married to other people during those 5 years, they definitely would have been a couple. He said they were made for each other. He said it with the calm authority of a man who had spent 50 years sitting with the knowledge of it and had decided finally that the world deserved to hear it said out loud. Van Dyke, characteristically, offered a different frame. He described the relationship as more of a sibling relationship than anything. He acknowledged that they had crushes on each other. He was that honest, at least, but insisted that what they had was different from a romance. Moore, in her own reflections, said that her relationship with Van Dyke was like the one you have with a favorite brother. Both of them reached, independently, for the same domestic metaphor, sibling, brother, as if the closest available language for what they shared was the language of family rather than the language of love. Which is interesting, because the language of family, at its best, in its most genuine form, is not a lesser thing than the language of romance. It is a different kind of love. It is the love that does not require possession, the love that does not demand exclusivity, the love that survives separation and distance and the passage of decades because it is not contingent on proximity, the way romantic love often is. It is, in many ways, the more durable kind. But Carl Reiner heard what they admitted privately. And Carl Reiner was a man who had spent his entire professional life understanding the difference between what people perform and what people mean. The show ended in 1966. Van Dyke went on to marry Poppins, which had already been released in 1964. one of the most beloved musical films in the history of American cinema, and to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang in 1968, and to a career that would span another 6 decades. Moore went on to create The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which premiered in 1970 and which was, in many respects, even more culturally significant than the show that made her famous. A comedy about a single working woman in her 30s that changed what American television understood about women's lives. They remained friends. They stayed in each other's orbit across the decades, appearing together at events, speaking warmly of each other in interviews, maintaining the particular connection that people maintain when they have shared something that neither of them can fully explain to anyone who was not there. And for 50 years, they each held, somewhere inside the story they told about those 5 years, the version that Carl Reiner would eventually tell for them. Carl Reiner died on the 29th of June, 2020, at the age of 98, in his home in Beverly Hills. He had lived long enough to outlast almost everyone he had ever loved. Long enough to see the world change beyond recognition. Long enough to watch the golden era of American television become history. Long enough to carry, for 3 years after Mary Tyler Moore's death, the knowledge of what she and Dick Van Dyke had admitted to him privately, and to decide that someone else should carry it too. What he said, in the days following Moore's death in January of 2017, was not said carelessly. Carl Reiner was not a careless man. He was a writer, which means he understood, with professional precision, the weight of words and the consequences of placing them in public. He had chosen, across 50 years of friendship with both Van Dyke and Moore, to keep what he knew private. He had watched them navigate their public lives, their marriages, their careers, their carefully maintained version of the story. He had respected the version they offered the world. And then, when Moore was gone, and the conversation could no longer hurt her in the ways that public conversation sometimes hurt people who are still living, he said what he had been holding. They had both admitted it. That was what he said. Separately, privately, in the way that people tell the truth when they are not performing for each other. If they had not been married to other people during those 5 years, those 5 extraordinary years on the set of the Dick Van Dyke Show, they definitely would have been a couple. He said they were made for each other. He said it as a statement of fact, with the flat certainty of a man who had been present for the evidence and had spent decades processing what the evidence meant. The response from Van Dyke, when the public version of this story circulated, was characteristically careful. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it in the terms Reiner had used. He offered, instead, the sibling frame. The idea that what they had was closer to a brother-sister relationship than to a romance. That the crushes they had on each other existed, but were categorically different from what Reiner seemed to be describing. He was honest enough to acknowledge the crushes. He was careful enough to draw a line around them. And this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because Van Dyke's version and Reiner's version are not necessarily in contradiction. They may, in fact, be describing the same thing from 2 different vantage points. Reiner was describing what he observed and what they admitted privately. Van Dyke was describing how he chose to understand and frame what he experienced. These are not the same operation. What a person admits in a private moment to a trusted friend, and what that same person is willing to carry as the official account of their own emotional history, are often very different things. Not because one is true and the other is false, but because the self is a story we tell about ourselves, and we have the right, and sometimes the need, to tell it in terms we can live with. Van Dyke had been married to Margie Willett since 1948, 13 years before the Dick Van Dyke Show began. They had 4 children together. The marriage endured, with difficulty, until 1984. During the 5 years of the show, He was a husband and a father, navigating the particular pressures of sudden fame and professional success, and daily proximity to someone who understood him in certain specific ways better than almost anyone else in his life. What he felt in that situation, what he admitted privately to Carl Reiner, was the truth of a man caught between the life he had built and the life that the universe, in its occasional and bewildering generosity, sometimes offers as an alternative. Moore, for her part, was in her own complicated marital situation during the years of the show. She had married Richard Carlton Meeker in 1955, and that marriage ended in 1961, the same year the show began. She married Grant Tinker in 1962, while the show was in its second season. She was, in other words, navigating her own version of the same complicated human territory. Building a new marriage while spending every working day with a man who delighted in her success and read her timing like no one else could. And what she said about it, publicly, in the interviews and reflections she gave over the decades, was this: she loved him. Not past tense, present tense, whenever she spoke of him. She loved his kindness. She loved his humor. She loved his dance. Everything about him, she said, she loved and connected to. She compared their relationship to what you have with a favorite brother. But the word she used, the word she returned to consistently, was love. Not admiration, not respect, not fondness. Love. There is something important in that word, and in the consistency with which she used it. Because love, even the sibling kind, even the love you have for a favorite brother, is not a small thing. It is not a professional courtesy. It is not the warm regard that colleagues develop for each other over years of shared work. It is something that asks to be named, and that resists being unnamed once it has been felt. Moore named it. She named it consistently, across decades, in interview after interview. She loved him, everything about him, connected to all of it. Van Dyke, who is 100 years old and who has outlived everyone who was part of those 5 years, has continued, in his own way, to circle the same territory without quite landing on the same word. He has described those years as the best 5 years of his life. He has described the chemistry between them as serendipity, a word that is interesting in its own right, because serendipity implies that something was found that was not being looked for, that the good thing arrived unexpectedly rather than as the result of intention or design. He has described the feeling of working with her as pleasure, not satisfaction, not professional pride, but pleasure. The word of a man who is reaching for something true and finding that the language of craft is the closest he can get to it without crossing a line he has decided not to cross. In his book published in November of 2025, 100 Rules for Living to 100, Van Dyke wrote with the particular honesty of a man who has reached an age where the cost of evasion no longer seems worth the effort. He wrote about loneliness. He wrote about the experience of outliving everyone you have ever loved. He wrote, "Every single one of my dearest lifelong friends is gone," which feels just as lonely as it sounds. It is a sentence that contains, in its simplicity, an entire inventory of loss. And Mary Tyler Moore, who died in January of 2017 at the age of 80, is part of that inventory. She had been ill for years before her death. She had lived with type 1 diabetes for most of her adult life, a condition she managed with the same discipline she brought to everything else. She had endured surgeries and health crises, and the slow, grinding work of maintaining a life under conditions that would have broken a less determined person. And through all of it, Van Dyke had watched from a distance, the distance that the years and the separate trajectories of their lives had placed between them. carrying whatever it was he carried about her. When she died, he did not wait. He went immediately to the place where people in 2017 went to say the things that needed saying quickly. He went to social media, to the platform then known as Twitter, and he wrote, "There are no words. She was the best." We always said that we changed each other's lives for the better. He put it in capital letters, the best, as if the ordinary scale of the letters was insufficient for what he needed to say. And then he wrote something longer, for the Hollywood Reporter, that is worth staying with. He wrote that outside of her family, he did not think there was anyone more proud of her than he was. "Just to watch her grow," he wrote, "was such a thrill for me." She left an imprint on television comedy. I got to be on hand and watch her grow into the talent she became. Read that again, slowly. Outside of her family, he placed himself explicitly in proximity to family. He was proud of her the way a parent is proud, or the way a sibling is proud. Not the way a colleague is proud, not the way an admirer is proud. He watched her grow. He was thrilled by it, and he got to be on hand, as if the privilege was not the work itself, not the Emmy Awards, not the millions of people who watched them every week, but simply the proximity, the being there, the getting to watch. Carl Reiner said they would have been a couple. Van Dyke said it was a sibling relationship. Moore said she loved everything about him. At 100 years old, Van Dyke is the only one left to hold all three versions simultaneously. And what he has chosen to do with them, what he has chosen to say and not say, to name and not name, is, in its own way, the final chapter of a love story that never quite became one. Mary Tyler Moore died on the 25th of January, 2017, at Greenwich Hospital in Greenwich, Connecticut. She was 80 years old. The cause was cardiopulmonary arrest. The heart, which had worked so hard for so long under the particular demands that her illness placed on it, simply stopped. She had been in declining health for some time. The people who loved her had been preparing, in the way that people prepare for things they cannot prevent, for the news that came that morning. The news arrived for Van Dyke, the way it arrives for everyone in the age of instant information. Suddenly, completely, without the buffer of distance or delay that earlier generations had between the event and the knowledge of it. One moment, she was alive, in the way that everyone you love is alive until they are not, present in the world, existing somewhere, reachable in principle, even if not in practice. And then she was not. He was 91 years old when she died. He had been married to Arlene Silver for 5 years, a marriage that had surprised the world, and that had given him, by his own account, a happiness and a vitality that he had not expected to find at that stage of his life. He had grandchildren. He had a life that was full, in the particular way that a long life accumulates fullness. Layer upon layer of experience and relationship and memory, compressed into something dense with meaning. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had been given more than his share of good things. And on the 25th of January, 2017, he sat down and wrote. The first thing he wrote was short. He went to the platform then known as Twitter, the public square of the era, the place where the immediate reaction lives, and he wrote the sentence that he needed to write first, before anything more considered or crafted could follow. "There are no words," he wrote. "She was the best. We always said that we changed each other's lives for the better." 3 sentences, each one doing a different kind of work. The first, "There are no words," is the acknowledgement that language is insufficient, that what is being felt exceeds what can be said. The second, "she was the best," is the superlative, capitalized because the ordinary scale of the letters cannot hold what he means by it. The third, "we always said that we changed each other's lives for the better," is the most interesting of the three, because it is not just a tribute. It is a memory. It is the record of a conversation that happened between them, in some specific moment or across many moments, in which they acknowledged to each other what they had been to each other. We always said, not "I believed," not "I felt," not "I think" now in retrospect. We always said, meaning she knew it too, and they had said it to each other, and the saying of it was part of what they had shared. That is not a professional courtesy. That is not the warm, careful language of two colleagues who worked together 60 years ago and maintained a cordial friendship thereafter. That is the language of two people who had, at some point or at many points, looked at each other and named what the other one meant to them. Then he wrote the longer piece, the tribute for the Hollywood Reporter, which is a different kind of document. It is not the immediate, unguarded reaction of a man reaching for his phone in the first hour of grief. It is the considered statement of a man who has had time to decide what he wants to say and how he wants to say it. And what he chose to say, in that more deliberate register, is worth examining with care. He wrote that outside of her family, he did not think there was anyone more proud of her than he was. That sentence alone contains an entire self-positioning. He places himself not among colleagues, not among admirers, not even among friends in the general sense, but in explicit proximity to family. He claims a pride in her that belongs, in its nature and its intensity, to the people who are closest to another person. He is saying, without quite saying it, that what he felt for her was not what you feel for someone you used to work with. It was something that belongs in a different category. He wrote that just to watch her grow was such a thrill for me. The word thrill is not a professional word. Satisfaction is a professional word. Admiration is a professional word. Pride, in its more restrained register, is a professional word. But thrill. Thrill is the word of someone who is describing a physical, emotional response to another person's existence and development. It is the word of a man who was moved, in the deepest sense, by watching Mary Tyler Moore become what she became. He wrote that she left an imprint on television comedy. That is the professional tribute, accurate, significant, appropriately scaled to her actual achievement. But then he added the personal one. I got to be on hand and watch her grow into the talent she became. That phrase, I got to be on hand, is the phrase of a man who understands that proximity to a particular person was a privilege and not a given. He did not take credit for her growth. He did not say he helped her grow, or that their collaboration shaped her, though both of those things were arguably true. He said he got to be on hand, as if the greatest gift of the whole experience was simply the being there, the getting to watch, the getting to witness, the getting to stand close enough to see what was happening. He also spoke, in those days after her death, to the Columbia Broadcasting System morning news program, and what he said there returns, with the persistence of something that cannot quite be resolved, to the subject of the chemistry. He said that he did not know he could sing and dance, and she knew that she could. He said that the chemistry that happened between them was just serendipity. He said they became an improv group. They could almost read each other's minds. Almost read each other's minds. That phrase sits at the center of everything. Because the ability to almost read another person's mind, to anticipate their next thought, to know their rhythm before they have completed it, to be so attuned to another human being that the line between their instinct and yours becomes difficult to locate, is not a professional skill. It is not something you acquire through rehearsal or technique. It is something that happens between specific people in specific circumstances, and it does not happen often. And when it happens, it does not go away simply because the circumstances that produced it have ended. He carried it for 56 years after the show ended. He carried it through Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and 3 marriages and the death of a son, and a battle with alcoholism that he addressed in rehabilitation in 1972, and decades of work and the slow accumulation of a century of living. He carried the memory of those 5 years, the best 5 years of his life, and the memory of the woman at the center of them. And when she was gone, he said what he could say. He said she was the best. He said they changed each other's lives for the better. He said he was proud of her, the way a family member is proud. He said the chemistry between them was serendipity, as if what they had found in each other was not something either of them had chosen, but something that had arrived, fully formed, as a gift from the universe. What he did not say, what he has never said, in any interview or tribute or public statement across 60 years, is the thing that Carl Reiner said he admitted privately. He has circled it. He has approached it from multiple directions. He has offered versions of the story that contain it implicitly without naming it explicitly. He has been, in this respect, the most careful and the most consistent kind of storyteller, the kind who knows exactly what they are leaving out, and leaves it out deliberately, not from dishonesty, but from a sense of what belongs to him and what belongs to her, and what belongs only to the silence between them. She is gone. Carl Reiner is gone. The writers who worked on the show are gone. The crew members who watched it happen every day are gone. Van Dyke wrote, in his book of November 2025, that every single one of his dearest lifelong friends is gone, and that it feels just as lonely as it sounds. He is 100 years old. He is, as far as the public record shows, the last person alive who knows the full version of this story from the inside. The last person who can hold, simultaneously, what Carl Reiner said and what Mary said and what he himself admitted privately and what he has chosen to say publicly, and the distance between all of those things. And he is still here, still married to Arlene Silver, who is 54 years old and who has given him, by his own account, a happiness that has extended his life in ways that medicine alone could not explain. Still drawing caricatures. He made one of Mary once and got her mouth too big, and she was furious with him, and he had to go back and draw it again. Still writing, still thinking, still carrying the memory of the woman who read him better than anyone else ever had. January 25th, 2017 was the day she was gone. But it was not the day she stopped being present in the story of his life. That day, if it comes, has not come yet. There is a particular kind of solitude that belongs only to the very old. It is not the solitude of loneliness in the ordinary sense, not the absence of company, not the silence of an empty room, not the particular ache of having no one to call. It is something more fundamental than that. It is the solitude of being the last witness, of carrying, inside a single consciousness, the memory of an entire world that no longer exists anywhere else. The faces, the voices, the specific quality of a room at a particular moment in time, and knowing that when you are gone, that world goes with you. Dick Van Dyke is 100 years old. He was born in 1925 in a country that had not yet experienced the Second World War, that had not yet invented television, that had not yet imagined the specific form of American celebrity that he would spend his life embodying and transcending. He has lived long enough to see everything he was part of become history. long enough to watch the medium that made him famous become something unrecognizable, long enough to outlast, one by one, every person who shared the best years of his life. He wrote about it in his book of November 2025, with the plain, undefended honesty of a man who has reached the age where the performance of equanimity is no longer worth the effort. "Every single one of my dearest lifelong friends is gone," he wrote, which feels just as lonely as it sounds. It is a sentence that does not ask for sympathy and does not perform stoicism. It simply states a fact. The loneliest fact available to a person who has lived long enough to accumulate and then lose an entire world of people who mattered. Carl Reiner is gone. He died in June of 2020 at 98. The man who saw Van Dyke on a Broadway stage and built a television show around what he saw. The man who watched the whole story of Dick and Mary from the front row and carried what he knew for 50 years before finally saying it out loud. The writers of the Dick Van Dyke Show are gone. The crew members who stayed late every night because no one wanted to leave are gone. And Mary Tyler Moore, the woman at the center of the best 5 years of his life, the woman whose mouth he drew too big in a caricature and who was so furious that he had to do it again, the woman who said she loved everything about him and connected to all of it, has been gone since January 25th, 2017. Van Dyke is the last one. And what does a person do with that? With the experience of being the last custodian of a shared memory that can no longer be shared? What do you do with the knowledge of what Carl Reiner said, and what Mary said, and what you yourself admitted privately? And the distance between all of that and the version of the story you have chosen to offer the world. What do you do at 100 years old with the memory of a woman who made everything better when she is no longer here to confirm or contradict or add her own version to yours? Van Dyke's answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from everything he has said and written across 6 decades, is this: you keep going. You stay curious. You stay present. You marry, at 86, a woman 46 years younger than you, who makes you feel, by your own account, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 your age, which, as he noted with the timing of a man who has never lost it, is still saying a lot. You write a book at 99 about the rules for living to 100. You draw caricatures. You talk to reporters who ask you about Mary Tyler Moore, and you give them the sibling frame, carefully, consistently, with the practiced ease of a man who has been giving the same careful answer for a very long time. But the careful answer and the true answer are not always the same answer. And at 100 years old, in the pages of a book written with the honesty that extreme age sometimes makes available, he let something through. He wrote about loneliness. He wrote about loss. He wrote about the experience of being surrounded by memories of people who are no longer there to share them. He was not writing about Mary specifically. He was writing about all of them, the whole inventory of the gone. But she is in that inventory. She is, by any reasonable measure, one of the central figures in it. The legacy she left is not in question. Mary Tyler Moore was one of the most consequential figures in the history of American television. Full stop, without qualification. She changed what the medium understood about women. She changed what comedy was allowed to be about. She demonstrated, across 2 landmark shows and a career that spanned 5 decades, that a woman could be the center of a story without being defined by her relationship to a man. And she demonstrated it first, in many ways, on the Dick Van Dyke Show itself, where Laura Petrie was a wife and mother who was nonetheless unmistakably, irreducibly her own person. The irony that the role which launched her required her to play someone's wife, the wife of the man she reportedly would have been with if things had been different, is the kind of irony that life produces occasionally, with a wit that surpasses anything a writer could construct deliberately. Van Dyke's legacy is equally unambiguous. 100 years of a life lived at the highest level of American entertainment. 5 Emmy Awards, a Kennedy Center honor, Mary Poppins, which is one of the most beloved films in the history of the medium, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, a career in comedy that demonstrated for 6 decades that physical genius and genuine warmth are not in opposition, that the funniest man in the room can also be the kindest, the most generous, the most thoroughly decent. And the 5 years, the best 5 years, that he shared with a woman whose name he has been saying, in one way or another, ever since she was gone. He got rid of the alcohol in 1972. He said so in his book. He got rid of the booze and the cigarettes and all that stuff, which is probably why he is still here. He is still here, 100 years old, still married to a woman who makes him feel decades younger, still drawing, still writing, still carrying the memory of the world he came from, and somewhere in that memory, layered beneath the Emmy Awards and the film credits and the Broadway shows and the century of accumulated living, is a television set in New Rochelle, New York, and a woman with dark hair and precise comic timing, and a warmth that registered as real rather than performed, and 5 years of daily collaboration that neither of them ever found a word adequate to describe. Carl Reiner had a word for it. He said they would have been a couple. He said they were made for each other. He said it when one of them was already gone, because that was the only moment when saying it out loud no longer carried the cost of disrupting the story they had chosen to tell. Van Dyke has his own word for it. He has called it a sibling relationship. He has called it serendipity. He has called it the best 5 years of his life. Moore had her word too. She called it love. She said it plainly, without qualification, without the careful framing that Van Dyke has always applied to the same territory. She loved him, his kindness, his humor, his dance, everything about him, connected to all of it. 3 words for the same thing. 3 people who were inside it, looking at it from 3 different angles, unable to agree on what to call it, and unable to deny that it was real. And now only one of them is left to hold all 3 versions, to be the last witness to a story that happened in a television studio in the 1960s and that has never quite finished happening. At 100 years old, Dick Van Dyke is still here, and the memory of a woman who made everything better, who read his timing like no one else could, who loved everything about him and connected to all of it, who was furious about the caricature he drew with her mouth too big, is still with him. That is not nothing. In fact, for a love story that never quite became one, it is just about everything. So tell us, do you believe that what Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore had was more than a professional partnership? Do you think Carl Reiner was right? Leave your answer in the comments below, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be talked about. And if the life of Dick Van Dyke, 100 years of grace and laughter and loss and the quiet, enduring memory of the woman who made the best years of his life possible, has moved you today, leave a tribute below for a legend who is still here, still drawing, still carrying the story. Subscribe to Golden Fame News, because the stories worth telling are the ones that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.